Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Autodesk Virtual Academy, brought to you by KETIV Technologies. I'm Eric Paul, engineer here at KETIV, and joined with us today is Jose Paredes now Clara. He's application engineer and Vault specialist. If you happen to be part of our Streamline service, he's our Vault manager. Anything Vault related over here, you're going to see Jose, working around.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be looking at setting up and configuring job processors for Vault. Jose, I'm going to hand it over to you. You want to explain what you're going over today?
Yeah. So like Eric mentioned, we're going to be talking about the job processor. And when talking about the job processor, like Eric mentioned, it does have to do with Vault. The first thing we want to know here is that it involves the Vault professional client here. So you will need one of those licenses. Usually it is set up on a separate machine that is used just for the job processor. The reason we do that is because it requires resources that are available on that computer, and this allows us to offload those resources from our customers. So what I mean by that is a lot of the times in our Lifeline, our support team, they'll get calls saying, hey, we're using Vault, we're trying to check in this file, but every time I check it in, it's taking us about 2 or 3 minutes to do it. Why is it doing that? A lot of the reasons is when you check it in, there is an option to generate a visualization file. Now, a visualization file in Vault is what you use to preview it, to even do markups inside of Vault for those that are familiar with markups. So these things aren't necessary. They're usually in the format of DWF or DWFX. And when you're checking it in, if you have this option turned on, it'll actually try to generate it on the spot. That means it's using up your computer's resources. It won't move forward until it actually finishes up generating that DWF or DWFX. This helps with that. What this does is, instead of generating it on your local computer, what it does is it sends it to this dedicated computer with its resources and puts it in a list saying, all right, job processor, you have this list of jobs to generate here. Not only does it generate the DWFs and DWFXs, it can be set up to generate PDFs. If you're on Vault 2020, you can do this automatically on lifecycle transitions and anything like that, or even on demand, sending it over to the job processor to generate. Another thing here is also ensuring that all the properties that you're sending up to Vault are up to date and match the ones on the files. It can go ahead as part of a job again, go ahead and use the resources on there to go ahead and go through this. Earlier I mentioned on 2020 you can automate the creation of PDFs, and that's also something that this tool is used for. On lifecycle transitions, you can automatically have it generate a brand new DWF or a brand new PDF. On the release of a file, if something gets updated, you can go ahead and have it generate new things, update the properties. The reason this one is important is because, as you know, when you release a file in Vault, usually it's locked to everyone. So it's only read-only, nobody can check it out, nobody can make edits to it. That's something different about the job processor. Usually when you do this, you set up a separate account just for the job processor that can make modifications in this release state. If you've ever tried to generate a visualization file for a released file in the past, you'll get an error say you don't have the adequate permissions. This is because, again, in released, usually you don't have those. And then, just like I mentioned earlier, visualization files on check-in offloads those resources over to the job processor. Moving forward here, as far as configuration, I mentioned earlier, it requires a Vault Professional license. This is a license that is running on a separate computer, or even, if someone's not using that computer heavily, they don't need that many resources, you can do it that way. Typically, we recommend it's on its own separate computer, though, where it won't actually affect any of the users, just for its resources. It works in the file environment. When I say by this, those of you that have Vault Professional, you know that when working with lifecycles, you do have a file environment where your lifecycles apply directly to your files. And then you also have an item environment where the scenario that I like to use, items are like containers where you put all relevant information. So you put all your files, your drawings, and then any related, Word documents or anything along those lines. It still can work inside of an item environment. It just requires additional tools, such as Cool Orange or custom jobs through the API. And is that something that we did?
Yes, that's something that I do myself. Yeah, a couple of you guys on here might have gotten some of those resources from me.
Yeah, yeah. So you can do it through Cool Orange. You can do it through an Eric, like we do here. So it's still possible even if you're in that item environment. The last thing we have here is that JP admin, so job processor admin. The first time I saw this user, I thought for some reason I had created a Jose Paredes admin account, but then I realized, nope, it's job processor. This is that separate account that I mentioned that you will need to create in order to have these jobs run without any issues. Make sure that you're still creating the appropriate files and updates inside of Vault. So the next portion here that we're going to go into is pretty much the settings and what job processor is, how it looks, what the steps are that you need to go through. The reason I say this is a lot of our customers have different types of environments, whether they be replicated, whether they just be, a single server. So a lot of these settings can help with that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the job processors here. And I will be using the job processor for Vault 2020. And this is what you'll see here when you go into the job processor. You'll see that right now it actually says that it's idle, which means it's not processing any jobs. Something interesting about this actually is you can set up the time intervals that it checks for jobs to be as long or as short as you want. By default, it's set up to check every 10 minutes. That means every 10 minutes, it'll check its list. Do I have any new jobs? Can I process anything? If no, then it waits another 10 minutes. Right now, I actually have it set up to actually check every 30 seconds. This is, again, just because I was testing some functionality with it, just making sure that I can pick it up as fast as we send it out. But jumping into the actual configuration of it, you'll see that I have some settings here under administration. It actually won't let me change any of this unless I pause the job processor. It doesn't want to try to process anything while the settings are being changed. So I actually have to come in here under File and pause it, and then it allows me to go into the settings. Now, settings are important because this is where you tell it to use the JP admin account as well as the password. But you can also tell it the server that you want to have it process jobs for. Now, the reason I say this is because we have customers with multiple replicated servers here. When working in a multiple replication environment, you don't want files generated in Chile to have to go all the way to, Minneapolis to actually be processed and have the defects generated and go back to Chile. So this is actually where you would tell it, okay, I want to go ahead and use the Chile server, and any jobs that go from the Chile server, I want to go ahead and process them on this machine. So in that case, because they have a multiple replication servers, you'll actually have to go around and set up a site for each one that you want to offload resources for. So again, this is where you would go ahead and tell it. Once you set up the JP admin, which we'll actually go into as well in a little bit, you can go ahead and just resume the job processor and have it look up the jobs that you need it to. Another thing that you can look up in this administration tab here is actually the job types that it can process. Sometimes when you look at these job types here, you'll see that some of them are checked on or off, this is because you can actually tell it which type of jobs that you want it to process. Sometimes you'll need to pick and choose which ones you want to process on this job processor. So this is where you would turn them on and off. They're pretty straightforward to read. Like you'll see here that there's Autodesk Vault DWF create, and there's actually a job type for each type of file inside of Vault. So you'll see there's inventor parts, inventor assemblies, project files, presentation files, and then the two different types of drawings. Now, these custom job types, again, would be modified if you do need to run something inside of the item environment. It would be something that we would automate through Vault Client specifically. Once you have the types of jobs that you want to run, you can actually go ahead and just let this thing run. A little trick of the trade here, if your default interval here is 10 minutes for the job processor, and you send a file to it, if you do have access to the job processor itself, a quick way to get it to check for new jobs is actually to pause it and then resume it. Once you do that, it automatically checks for new jobs once it resumes. So if you don't want to wait the whole 10 minutes and you're doing some testing, you can actually pause it and resume it if you don't want to go ahead and change that timing interval. So next thing we're going to go in here is actually the setup inside of Vault. Now this part's important, again, because we need to make sure that the JP admin that we have as a user has all these special permissions inside of Vault. So we're going to go to Tools, Administration, and then Vault Settings. Again, this is, again, for JP admin, just like it sounds, we typically want to give it, when we create the user itself, we want to give it administrator privileges in there just to make sure that there's nothing that bogs it down when it tries to create a job, having it error out.
And just to review real quick, is this JP admin account something that comes default with Vault?
Not default with Vault. The only one that actually comes default with Vault is the administrator account. So any additional accounts here will have to be created manually within Vault. Yeah, it's just a separate account that you'll need to create and have it in there. A lot of you will be that have been using Vault for a long time and haven't used the job processor will notice you don't have one in there. It's just something that we actually create, and you don't have to call it JP admin. It's just something that we like at KETIV, we like to keep it consistent among all the implementations that we do. So
yeah, really descriptive.
Yeah. So going into behaviors, again, it's going to be when we're doing it in life cycles. So if you're working in a file environment, when you're working inside of Vault, you'll be using what are called life cycles in here. So we're going to go into our Vault settings, behaviors, and life cycles. And I'm actually going to go into our standard flexible release process. A lot of you, if you're already in this environment, you might not be using this one. You might be using your own custom one. But this is pretty much a lot of the times when we work with our customers, this is the life cycle that they actually base it on. It might have additional ones. It might remove some, but overall, it's the pretty standard one here. I'm going to go ahead and edit this here. And the one thing you want to do here is actually, so in work in progress, since you typically have everyone allowed to view and modify and delete in here, you don't need to make any special permissions for JP admin by adding them to the list. But if you do have any restrictions in any of the states, whether it be work in progress or for review or released, you'll see specifically released here, everyone is only allowed to read. That means nobody's allowed to modify. So what I ended up doing is adding my JP admin account here. For those of you that haven't done it before, you'll see that if you try to add a specific line, you can search by users and groups. And then if this wasn't on here, you would be able to just go ahead and add the JP admin to the list of users that have specific permissions in this state. again, we want to allow JP admin to have read and write permissions in this state just for when it gets a job and it needs to create a new file, a new visualization file. It goes ahead and has those permissions and doesn't run into any errors.
Yeah, you can kind of think of this as like a super user that would have permissions that normally anyone working on it wouldn't have, so they can actually do these updates of properties and visualization files.
Exactly. The next part we want to look at is when we want these things to happen, or when we want specific things to work. What I say by that is we can have it generate, again, PDFs. We can have it generate DWF visualization files on specific transitions. So if you're working with life cycles, whenever something goes from full review into released, do I want something to happen with job processor? Well, in this case, we're gonna go to that specific transition and edit what goes on. For those of you that have seen our previous AVAs on these, you know that there's a few things that you can do in here to set up conditions and set up actions. Well, we're gonna go into actions here. And as you can see, there is an option here to actually synchronize properties using the job server. The job server that it's talking about here is actually the job processor server. It's going to, it's that specific resource machine here. So we're going to go ahead and turn that on. But not only can we sync those properties, there's actually a drop-down menu here that we can do. And there's a bunch of other options that we can do. You know, do we want to synchronize properties and update the view? Again, when it says update the view, it's talking about that visualization file, that DWF or DWFX that it generates. Do I want to go ahead and update the PDF? Again, this is on Vault 2020, so you have this option to do it on transitions. And then, do I want to go ahead and sync the properties, update the view, and update the PDF? Well, you can go ahead and do that as well. And when I'm talking about, you know, Vault 2020 specifically here, in the past releases of Vault or 2019, you were still able to generate PDFs, but it would be only to a released state. So the state that you send it into would have to be a released one in order for the PDF to work. In 2020, the option is to do it on all states. Now, I know this is something big for a lot of our customers. They like to have a running tally of PDFs as the drawings go through. So that's one of the features in Vault 2020. And just to clarify there, it does not do 3D PDFs. So if you're thinking about parts or assemblies and generating PDFs for those, it's not doing that now. This is mostly for drawings that are being modified and released. So for this case, what we're going to actually do is we're going to go ahead and synchronize the properties and update the view, which means we're going to have it generate a new DWF for us here whenever it goes from for review into released. So we're going to go ahead and do that. As far as just going to go ahead and something you also want to go ahead and double check security here. This allows you, this tells you who can make these transitions. We want to make sure that a specific person or specific users are allowed to do this, whether it be admins or, you know, the general designers. So going in here, gonna go ahead and gonna actually change the category here of our assembly into engineering, which will put it in a life cycle here. And you'll see that it actually put it into the flexible release process that we just modified. And what we're gonna do is change the state here to for review, which is fine. And then what we're gonna do here is actually, and just to show that, again, my timing here is actually pretty quick, so I wanna make sure we don't miss it. I'm gonna go ahead and pause this here so that it's not checking for a job while we do this, but I'm gonna go ahead and change the state to released and just send it through. Now that it's in released, what it does is, since we told it send a job to the job processor, we can actually check the jobs that are currently being sent by going to tools and checking the job queue. So once we open the job queue, you will actually see the list of jobs that are waiting to be processed by the job processor and what they are. So, they get an ID and a priority here. And as far as status, which lets you know in some cases, if that JP admin doesn't have permissions, you'll get an error there. And then description, which is what is actually going to go ahead and happen. A lot of the times, usually you want someone double checking on this. We've seen cases where, someone doesn't know that the job processor is on a specific machine and it gets turned off. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden you have 200 jobs waiting in the queue because nobody was monitoring it or nobody was in charge of the job processor. So it is a separate machine. We still want somebody to have access to it or have knowledge of it so that nobody, turns off the machine that, it's just taking up power. No, you want to make sure that someone is aware of it. So again, we have this job now pending in our job processor. It's not processing because we paused it, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually resume here. You'll see that it processed as soon as I unpaused it. It goes ahead and runs through the Vault sync properties, and it creates the DWF here. As soon as it's done with its job, it just goes ahead and closes out. We can go ahead and do a refresh on the job queue, and you'll see that there's nothing left here. Again, this job processor itself is set up on my own computer, so it's using my resources, but you can see how engineers or other users in here can go about their day, go through their workflow, and not have to worry about, that happening on their end there.
Yeah, because I can imagine, if we were to just put back in, say, a large assembly, and that all needed to happen on someone's computer, if that took, say, 10 seconds, and you have, 1,000 different parts and something like that, that's going to take a long time. So this is a really great way to offload that. One of the things, could you show us, Jose, for that JP admin account, could you show us how that gets created and kind of some of the setup for that?
Yeah, no worries. So again, it's not an account that comes by default with your Vault. So again, for this setup, you will need an administrator in general to do it. So what you want to go ahead and do is go to Tools, Administration, and then Global Settings. The difference here between Global and Vault is you can have multiple vaults on one server. And then Vault settings will affect the specific vault that you're logged into. Global settings are things that affect the multiple vaults or all the vaults on this one ADMS or server. So we're going to go into Global Settings. We're going to go ahead and manage the users. And then what you would typically do here is actually just create a new user. Typically, you would for job processor, I like to give it a first name and last name. And then the username, like I said, it's really up to you how you want to use it. But JP admin typically is pretty consistent across our implementations, and it gives us the option of, if they look at the first name, last name, they see job processor and then JP admin. It kind of makes that connection for any new admins or any transition in power there, people maintaining it. Well, what's this JP admin? Do we really need it? Deactivates it. Well, if it's JP admin and you have job processor, it's something that they'll be able to identify. Typically, we don't give it a password here, so that whenever we log in through the job processor, it's pretty easy for whoever's running in there. Or, if you do want to password protect it, because again, it is a super user, you would give it a password at this point.
Highly recommended.
Yes. Usually with super admins, you want to go ahead and either make it a password that is very limited to the people who know it. You want to make sure that maybe only your admins or your top Vault admin has it. This is where you would go ahead and provide that. As far as roles, we want to make sure, again, that we give it the administrator role. This is, again, we're creating a super admin. We want to go ahead and give it the top level. You may think, don't I want to give it all the roles? It's a super admin. We want it to go ahead and be able to do everything. The answer is no. The way that Vault permissions work, and I've talked about it in past AVAs, is if there is a permission that limits something for a user, that is the permission that Vault goes for. So if anything is explicitly denied, if there is literally one permission in there that says, no, this user cannot do it, it doesn't matter if you have 30 other permissions that say, yes, he can. Vault will take that one deny and say, well, can't do it. This user's been denied here. So you just want to go ahead and limit the amount of things that can cause things to go wrong inside the job processor. So you give it the admin account here. As far as vaults, again, like I mentioned, you can go ahead and have multiple vaults on one server. I have multiple on my laptop here. So you want to go ahead and make sure that the JP admin has access to the ones that it will be processing jobs for. And then as far as groups, groups is a different way of managing permissions. You can apply permissions to a group specifically. So if you do have an administrator group and you think, well, I have a group of super users, super administrators, I don't think I need to go ahead and modify the permissions for this JP admin separately, you can go ahead and just add the JP admin to your super group, and that'll go ahead and apply the appropriate permissions. Just gonna go ahead and hit cancel here just because I already created it, so it's gonna yell at me. So just in general, how to create the JP admin here. Overall, it's a pretty simple tool to use, but the impact of it we feel is actually very, very useful. It helps out, especially in large working environments where, whether it be large as far as customer base or user base, where you have a lot of drafters or a lot of engineers, taking up that visualization time. Again, like Eric said, if it takes like 10 seconds per file, they're checking in, like 30 files a day, and then you have 20 users, that time adds up every day when it can actually be processed somewhere else. Or even with large assemblies, if you have a large assembly and it's taking a very long time to process that file on check-in because you need a visualization file, and even if you're like, oh, I'm just going to turn it off, I'm not going to run that visualization file when I check it in, well, down the line, if you do need to preview that anyway, someone will have to take up that resource, someone will have to generate it on their computer, and that just slows them down. So the impact of it, again, is what we were looking for here with job processor. But just to recap what we went over what the job processor was, the solution or the solutions that it brings as far as, resources and PDF generation on those transitions, and pretty much speeding up the workflow of your day-to-day activities, as well as how to set it up, how to set up the user that will be running these jobs to make sure that there are no conflicts, to make sure that even if a file is released, you still have a visualization file on release there to be able to send out to your customers, to be able to share. A lot of the cases, if you have drawings that are going down to the shop and you're using Thin Client, you don't want them to be able to see something that is in progress. Again, you don't want them to build the wrong thing. So when a file is finally released, you want to make sure that they have the most up-to-date drawing. Well, job processor will ensure that, will make sure that you don't have to manually generate every time. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and send them in here through Zoom. We'll go ahead and answer any of them right now.
Yeah, so while those are coming in, one of the other really cool things about jobs and the job processor here, from my point of view, is that with jobs, you can really run any code you want. So it kind of creates this interesting connection to the outside world where, you can make a job that does something like, attach a PDF back into an item, or maybe you want to send that newly released model up to your ERP system. You can really do a whole lot with this. It's really cool.
Yeah, and again, offloading that resource to somewhere else. And correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but this is what you're talking about as far as custom job types.
Yes.
Pretty much you would create the job type that, or the job that you want to run on this transition, and then apply it here. You just add the job type. It knows that whenever this transition happens, all right, we're going to send this to the job processor, and the job processor will actually take care of what you need done.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining. Join us next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.